This third challenge is also split into two halves, and we're also going to introduce some other concepts that you haven't used yet. In the first tab, you'll find this scenario, where every quarter you extract a sales report from a poorly designed system. As a result, you have one table per quarter of sales. Now, you want these to be consolidated into one single table, but there's an added complexity here, is that you want the table to be summarized by brand, and brand is actually tucked away as part of the product name here. So you're going to have to think about how to extract that. So import both of these tables separately into Power Query, do the transformations you need to do, and place your output here. In the second example, your team is responsible for optimizing stock levels for most products in the business. The exception is that if products sell below 200 in Q1, the product will be delisted and therefore does not fall under your remit. You'll also need to establish a ranking of products so you know where to prioritize your efforts. So the system has generated you a report which looks like this table on the left-hand side. Some of these products seem to be sold online as well as elsewhere, and yet the summary we want is simply one row per product. So you're going to have to do some consolidation there, and you're going to have to do some conditional ranking using the Q1 sales column to define which of those groups each product belongs in. As usual, make sure you have a go yourself before you look at my proposed solution. Good luck. Let's take a look at the first part of this third challenge, where we had to import two tables and consolidate those sales values by brand to give us this table on the right-hand side. The added complexity here, though, is that the column names are not the same in both tables, so we're going to have to deal with that slightly differently than just with irregular append tables. Let's see how I did that in Power Query. The first step I took was actually to import the second table just as is into Power Query, and then I can refer to that table in my other query. So in my other query, first I brought in the first table, and then I simply use a table append to bring the rows of those two tables together. But as you can see, instead of the 3 columns that we had before, now we have 4, because in the second table, the column is called Q2 sales. Now there's a few different ways we can deal with this, so I'm going to show you a couple and I'll give you some ideas of maybe a more advanced method that you can look into. So the method I've saved in the example that you'll see in your file first starts by extracting that brand from the product name column. So that's simply extracted text after delimiter, and I use the dash that appears there. Once I've got that, I was just interested in the total sales across these 2 quarters. So I replaced all the nulls with zeros and inserted an addition column across these 2 to give me total sales. That then gave me all the information I need to group total sales by brand, which leaves me with a much simpler table, and then I just sorted it to make sure it was in order of total sales. And we could even go one step further there and rename that column to brand. Now that seems to work just fine, but as usual, let's consider what would happen if the data evolved over time and therefore changed format slightly. We already know that the scenario is somewhat complicated by having 2 quarters of sales. And our solution to that was to add up those 2 columns to give us total sales. But what's going to happen next quarter when we have a 3rd quarter of sales? That 3rd quarter isn't going to be captured by the total sales column. So we're going to have to come in and amend our query, which really isn't optimal. So let's make a duplicate of this query, and I'm going to show you maybe a more future-proof way of doing it. Let's call this version 2. So I'm going to remove the final few steps that we have there, the insert of the addition. And so we go back to this stage where we have the brand column, which we can rename, the category column, which we don't need, and we have these 2 columns of quarterly sales. Instead of trying to manually define which columns to capture, this would be far easier to aggregate if we simply had one column of sales and a different column defining the sales period. What I want to do is unpivot all of the quarterly sales columns. Again, thinking more carefully about this, we have a choice to make. Do we unpivot these columns by using this button here, the unpivot columns? Or do we click brand and unpivot the other columns? And as usual, I would recommend unpivoting the other columns. And that means that your query is going to be responsive to however many other columns there are. So on brand, unpivot other columns. Now we can group the sales by brand. And we'll have a column called total sales, which sums across values. And there we have the same table, but this time it's going to be responsive to any number of quarters in our data. And I'll just sort that in descending order again. A third and perhaps more complicated way you could have tried this would be still to create that addition column here on the right hand side, but this time to try and capture any column names which have the word sales in them. And maybe you'd have to do that with some sort of wildcard. So perhaps we'll explore that in a different video at a later stage. But that is significantly more advanced than what we've been through in Power Query fundamentals or this challenge. So I'm going to leave it there for now. So again, from a relatively simple example there, we've seen yet another case where we need to think ahead and not just solve the problem that's in front of us, but think about how this data is going to evolve over time. And generally, to do that, we need to understand where the data comes from, in what format it's sourced, so that we can plan ahead and make sure these queries don't break in the future. The second part of this challenge required us to consolidate this table of sales on the left-hand side, and in particular to consolidate so that we had one row per product. Once we'd done that, we had to identify to which category each product belonged based on the amount of sales. We had to identify the top performing product. We had to identify high and good performers based on the range of sales, and anything below this 200 value that we're told at the start is not relevant to our team. So let's check out how I did that in Power Query. The first obvious problem in our source table is that we have multiple rows for certain products, so we need to get rid of that first. And since we're consolidating by the product itself, we don't really care about what appears after this space dash space, i.e. sold online. So we can extract the text before the delimiter, and I've made sure to use space dash space, not just the dash. If I extracted everything before the dash, line 2 would appear as product 1 space. So you may have come across that issue. With that change made, it's easy enough for us to group the rows by product. At this point, I want to start categorizing sales, and the first product I want to identify is the top performing product. So I'm simply going to do that by sorting the rows to leave me with the top product at the top, adding an index so I know which product is first, and then using that in my conditional column to create my categories. So let's have a look at the logic that I've used here. We can either look at this logic in the formula bar or by opening the settings bar. So I've said if the index equals 1, then identify this product as a top performer. If the sales are greater than or equal to 350, it's a high performer. The same with 200 is a good performer, and anything else is not relevant to my team. Once I have those categorizations, I can remove the index column. The key here was to get the delimiter correct when you pulled out that product name, and secondly, to find a creative way to identify that top product in the table.